ACS governor. One area of research interest is in surgical education, and he's going to enlighten us today on teaching in the operating room, I believe. So.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to present. It's a real honor to be here, and I've always enjoyed the Southwestern Surgical Congress. It's a great group, and I've been attending this for many years. I want to start also by saying that I have no disclosures. It's also for me an honor to be the speaker for this particular talk, given that I had the opportunity to know Dr. Organ during his time on the Pacific Coast. He was a phenomenal educator, and he believed that surgeons have a responsibility to share their knowledge with younger generations. So I think it's appropriate that I speak today a little bit about surgical education in the operating room. And what I'd like to focus on are these following areas. First, to sort of talk a little bit about the modern trainee, how autonomy has changed, the OR environment and how you can improve the OR environment. Then finally, some things that great teachers do, and then some concluding remarks. I feel that the modern trainee faces a challenging juggling act that can be likened to juggling flaming chainsaws or juggling elephants when you think about what they've gone through in their careers. Residents today face many more hurdles to reach their career goals than we did decades ago. To start with, high school itself has become much more stressful. You think about the courses that they have to do, including advanced placement exams, all the sports that they participate in. And there's no surprise then that when you look at wellness of college students entering college, there's been a significant decline in college students' wellness over the years. Once they get to college, students are faced with things such as double majors, doing research and shadowing, going on medical missions, gap years to strengthen their application. And then it doesn't stop in medical school. They have pressures of USMLE, they actually have to apply for sub-internships, apply to many more programs than we did. They include research years in medical school now. And then once they get to residency, you have now multiple disciplines that you have to learn, including robotic, laparoscopic, open, endovascular, endoscopic. There's courses to take like FLS, FES, and ATLS, many of which didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. And there's also more pressure on residents today to do fellowships. And so I would argue that today competition is everywhere for residents entering residency. And there's been an explosion of information over the last few decades, far beyond what the human mind can process. And so today's surgical resident on top of that comes home not to be able to relax, but is dealing now with EMR, returning emails, PowerPoint presentations, logging OR cases, and on top of that as well, family responsibilities. And yet they have to at the same time hear that they're not ready for independent practice. And when you look at studies today, there's many studies that say that US residents are not ready for independent practice and that general surgery residency inadequately prepares them for fellowship. And so today's surgical resident faces an increase in work demands throughout their lives that is juxtaposed with a loss of autonomy. And an example of this is something I found from 1979, which was, is your child ready for first grade? And so these are kindergartners, and this is what they had to do to be able to progress to first grade. So they asked, can your child stay within the borders in coloring? Can they tell the left hand from the right hand? Can they use a two-wheel bicycle? But this is the one that really struck me, is can they travel alone in a neighborhood 4 to 8 blocks to the store, to the school, or to the playground, or to a friend's house? I can't imagine today that we would be allowing 5-year-olds to do that. And yet this is a reflection of the autonomy that we used to give children decades ago. And so here we feel like, and another example, that we feel like we can't allow our kids autonomy because the world has become so violent. And yet when you look at violent crime, there's been a dramatic reduction in violent crime over the last several decades. There's a reduction in the report of missing children, yet we're not allowing our children to play in the streets. Child mortality has dropped significantly in the US and Canada. And yet we have this era of helicopter parents who are overlooking every single activity that their children are doing, making sure that they're safe and observing their every single moment of their daily lives. And in fact, in this study looking at the impact of helicopter parenting, surprisingly, the recruiters for jobs were saying that their parents are actually involved in the recruiting of the jobs for these children. And the children themselves, or these now young adults, are consulting their parents about whether they should proceed with taking a job or not. To those parents then try to give autonomy to their children, you find these things in the internet. Parents investigated for letting their kids walk alone. Parents arrested for letting their children play outside. And so I bring these points up because our residents today are facing an environment where they're working much more, working much harder, yet they don't have this opportunity for autonomy. And rather than having opportunities to be mindful, where they're relaxed, aware, and are able to self-pace themselves, their mind is full. There's so many activities going on in their brain. They're anxious, stressed, and distracted. And this creates problems in terms of trying to develop your own sense of self-worth and your sense of accomplishment. And when you look at what's the so-called self-determination theory, we all really have 3 psychological needs, and those are demonstrated here, including competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And those then drive motivation. And if you lack autonomy, this really thwarts your motivation and really affects your well-being. When you look at it a different way, what is it that really leads to autonomy? Number one, you really need to have the ability, need to have the desire, but you also need the freedom. And so I say this all because as we tailor our surgical education to the modern trainee, the teacher must be aware that the modern trainee has had to juggle much more than we did during our training. They feel that they're always being watched and judged. They may feel less confident. But yet they have a higher sense of pressure to achieve, and they have less autonomy growing up, but they definitely want that during residency. But they also want structure, guidance, and feedback. And so as we, as teachers, look at how we approach teaching residents, we must teach with compassion and recognize that they are just as capable and ambitious as we are. And arguably, they've achieved much more before residency than we did. It's just that the rules have changed, and it's not something they've asked for. So we need to take full advantage of the time we have in the OR in teaching our future trainees. And so the surgeon teacher should ensure that they provide interactive and engaging educational experiences. We need to provide mentorship that will foster success and develop ways to provide graduated autonomy in the operating room. Here's another study that shows that resident autonomy, unfortunately, has severely decreased over the last 15 years. It has been rapidly declining. And it's also important to be aware that in several studies, when you look at multivariate associations with who is given autonomy, understandably, autonomy is associated with case difficulty and level of training, but interestingly, resident gender is also a factor, with women being provided less autonomy than men. This other study seems to reinforce that and shows that resident autonomy and verbal feedback differ, and that again, women are receiving less autonomy than men. And so then it's important to ask yourself, what is it that drives autonomy? And this study in JAMA investigated that concept and talked about the concept of faculty entrustment, and found that faculty entrustment has the strongest influence on resident entrustability in the operating room. It's not the years of faculty training, it's not the case difficulty. And so when you looked at the study, what were the main triggers of granting autonomy to residents in the operating room? One was increased familiarity and trust with the resident's capabilities. Another one was how well the resident comes prepared to the operating room. But finally, interestingly, it's also how confident that faculty member felt that they could fix anything in the operating room that transpired. And so in trying to drive faculty entrustment, you need to learn, or the faculty need to learn, the ability to be present in the operating room without necessarily always driving every aspect of the operation. And this may actually be a feature of the faculty themselves' teaching style. And studies have suggested that this could be amenable to faculty development efforts. Building resident entrustment is really important. And one of the techniques that I like to use is to ask the resident to give me a call the night before to discuss all the cases. This reassures me that they've read about the patient. It confirms that they have the planned procedure in mind and provides an opportunity to discuss the operative plan. There's also some other important behaviors that help in driving techniques for providing autonomy, as demonstrated here. But one thing that's important to say is that, faculty are always saying, well, I can't allow residents autonomy because the outcomes will be bad. And yet, when you look at the data, that's really not the case. This study looked at the association between operative autonomy and patient outcomes among over 1 million surgical patients. And 10% of them were performed by residents alone, 23% were performed by surgeons only, and about 66% were performed by residents and surgeons. And there was no difference in mortality, no difference in morbidity. And when they looked at operating times, understandably, if the surgeon was operating alone, those were faster than resident operating alone by 10 minutes. But when the resident operated alone, that was actually faster than the resident plus the surgeon. This study also looked at the declining resident autonomy, but noted that, interestingly, surgical outcomes over the last several decades have been dramatically improving regardless of resident involvement. And in this database, they found that resident autonomy really did not affect outcomes, that in fact the outcomes were the same when residents are involved, despite the fact that operations are getting more difficult, patients are getting older, and patients are getting sicker. Here's a study that we did several years ago looking at senior residents as teaching assistants. And in this study, we compared residents as teaching assistants compared to faculty teaching cases, and found that overall the risk of biliary injury and complication rates weren't different. So one of the areas that has really suffered is the teaching assistant, resident as teaching assistant in the US. And these studies also further look at ways of enhancing confidence in graduating residents by establishing a chief resident service. And this other one study on the right implemented a resident acute care surgery service where the residents were primarily responsible for the day-to-day care of the patients, and demonstrated again that there was really no difference in outcomes. So just to summarize, then, residents want, and I feel deserve, autonomy, and there's no evidence that graded autonomy is bad for patient outcome. So successful teachers have clear objectives when they go to the operating room. And so this is called the BID model. And I encourage all of you, if you haven't used it, to try to adopt it. And this BID model involves what's called briefing, intraoperative teaching, and debriefing in the operating room. And this can start at the scrub sink, where you just briefly go over your plan for the day with the resident. The briefing can be a very quick thing of 2 minutes, where you can identify objectives for the operation. You can ask, you can ask the resident, what area or technique would you like to focus on today? Or alternatively, you can tell the resident, I would like to focus on the following areas. And then intraoperative teaching involves brief, focused interactions during the operation that can be just a few minutes. And this can be focused on specific things, learning objectives, and can be augmented by certain teaching scripts. And then finally, the important part is a debriefing afterwards, where you importantly allow the trainee to reflect on what they have learned in the operating room. Then you can reinforce with them what they did right, and then importantly also correct mistakes. Successful teachers also know when and how much stress to apply to their trainee. And if you look at this curve here, looking at student anxiety level and student performance, it clearly shows that if you apply no stress, yes, things are easy, but people don't learn. If you apply too much stress, indicated on the right, you really shut down, and the person really isn't able to learn and accomplish what they need to accomplish. Another way of looking at it is this zone of proximal development. And this is really a theory that looks at child development. And in the outer circle, what a child is ready and developing, what a child is not developmentally ready to do, what a child can do with help, and what a child can do without help. And an example I give is when I was a second-year resident, I got to scrub with an attending who normally scrubbed with chief residents. And his technique was to allow the resident to basically do whatever they could do as he was watching till they couldn't do anymore. Well, it turned out I got to scrub on a common bile duct exploration, which I'd never seen or done. And he stood there just letting me proceed, but I couldn't do anything. I didn't know what to do. And so then he basically just took over and said, okay, well, maybe next time. And I remember leaving the operating room feeling completely sort of useless and not very, not very capable. And I think what happened was his experience was working with senior residents who had this operative experience before. And so I think it's important that you tailor the education in the operating room to the level and skill level of that specific resident. Successful teachers create an optimal OR environment. And it's important to realize that a distracted learner is an inefficient one. In the book, The Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell talks about Isaac Perlman, who is such an expert that while he's playing at a concert, he's thinking about what he's going to cook that night. It's just incredible to think that somebody could do that. But that's not the case with brand new learners. If you've ever tried to have a casual conversation with someone when they're trying to learn a new technique, they suddenly stop and they can't focus anymore. And so I think it's important to make sure that the operating room is ideally created in a way that does not distract that learner. As I said, it's really important to eliminate all distractions. This study from the Annals of Surgery looked at the impact of operating room distractions and stress on stress, workload, and teamwork in the operating room. And it was really quite eye-opening for me, the number and volume of distractions that occur in the operating room. And these include things like external staff who are entering and exiting, case-irrelevant conversation initiated by staff, acoustic distractions such as the OR phone ringing, mobile phones ringing, pagers going off, radio, equipment noise, and then, as I mentioned, case-irrelevant conversation by nurses, anesthesiologists, and nurses. Equipment distractions as well. And so I think it's important for you as the surgeon in teaching your trainees that you be aware that your operating room is vulnerable to these types of distractions. Put the phones away and try not to bring excessive noise to the operating room. Since I'm from Argentina originally, and Argentina just won the World Cup, I had to bring up Messi. And I say, imagine Messi getting a phone call just before his World Cup penalty kick. There's no way that you're going to have these distractions. And yet this is what's happening in our operating room. So as I said, extraneous conversations slow the learner down. It really doesn't contribute to efficiency. And in my view, I would avoid quizzing trainees about irrelevant things in the operating room. Once you start quizzing them about anatomy as they're trying to learn a technique, they stop their operation and they start thinking about the question. And it really doesn't help, in my view, in trying to acquire their skill. Now, the other topic is music in the operating room, which is a favorite topic of mine. I know there's probably a lot of different views on this topic of music in the operating room. Is it good or bad? This is an interesting study that just came out last year that looked at the effect of background music in the OR on surgical outcomes. And it was actually one of the few prospective single-blinded case control studies. And it looked at patients undergoing breast cancer surgery. And in one group, there was no music. In another group, there was slow music. And in the final group, there was tempo or fast tempo music. And this study showed that there was no effect on complication rate. Yet there was a 10% reduction in operating room time in those that were listening to fast music. We ourselves did a study looking at trainees, because one of the arguments is, well, that's okay if you're a seasoned surgeon, you can listen to music, but what about if you're a trainee? Well, what we did is we looked at novice trainees performing a simulated vascular anastomosis with and without music. And we measured time of completion and actually attached to the Castroviejo and the pickup a little cable that tracked their hand motion, that had shown that hand motion of experts have specific types of jerking. And we also video performed them. What they didn't know as they were doing these anastomosis is that suddenly music came on during one anastomosis and wasn't on the other. And interestingly, relaxing music, which is what we chose, did not affect the performance of novices in this simulated study. But there are other studies that have looked at this too. This study, one looked at the effect of music on robotic-assisted laparoscopic performance that suggested that they actually perform better. This other study, a prospective randomized study on the effect of music on efficiency of surgical closure among plastic surgery residents, similarly showed that they were faster. And finally, from a patient perspective, if you're doing an operation under local or regional, there are many studies that show that music in the operating room relaxes the patient and may actually lower the requirement for opioids. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody suddenly turn the music on, and I think that really is an individual preference. And one of the things that sometimes becomes contentious in the operating room is who should choose the music. Should it be the surgeon? Should it be the anesthesiologist, or should it be the nurse? So we actually performed a survey on this topic and asking nurses, anesthesiologists, and surgeons what they thought. And interestingly, 91% were actually in favor of music in the operating room. However, of course, the surgeons thought more likely that they should be deciding who should play the music, whereas the anesthesiologists and the nurses thought that it should be a collaborative decision. So my recommendations in terms of trying to create an optimal environment there is to put away the cell phone, hand off a pager, politely ask a nurse not to interrupt for non-essential conversations, ask others to keep the conversations to a low volume, and if music is played, choose the volume and genre that everybody can agree upon. So successful teachers also care about the well-being of their students. And one of the things that we've learned over the last few years is that the rate of injury for surgeons is really much worse than we used to think that it was. And there really has become an epidemic of musculoskeletal disorders among surgeons. And one of the articles, a meta-analysis, likened the risk of occupational injury among surgeons to that of coal miners. And so as a good educator, we need to be aware of this and be cognizant of this risk and help our trainees to think about how they can avoid future injuries. And so one of the things that has actually become quite interesting is the idea of doing intraoperative stretching. And this study, which was a very interesting study, looked at the idea of an OR stretch and found that in fact, stretching in the OR for brief periods of time, taking breaks, increased physical performance, improved mental focus, lowered fatigue, and reduced overall discomfort. And now there's actually videos, many of them available from Mayo Clinic, that teach you some of the stretching techniques. And also there's been more and more emphasis on the idea of taking micro breaks. How many of you actually take micro breaks in the operating room? Not that many. And this study looked at the effects of intraoperative micro breaks on mental and somatic operator fatigue in a prospective randomized way. And they actually measured cortisol levels by going under the mask and taking a little bit of saliva to measure the cortisol levels, and randomized surgeons to taking the breaks or not. And they found that those that took these quick 5-minute breaks had less stress, had lower cortisol levels, and there was no change in the operative length of the case. And so one of the things that I like to do then is to take a little break in the operating room, do a little stretching, and at the same time, tell a story. Successful teachers, in my view, enjoy and like telling stories that are applicable to their trainees. This was an interesting study from the American Journal of Surgery that talked about war stories, a qualitative analysis of narrative teaching strategies in the operating room. And when you looked at this, there were 3 main types of stories that emerged. One was practice lessons from their own prior experiences that could be applicable to that patient. And so for me, for example, I will tell a story of near misses or adverse events. And I tell, for example, when I'm doing an AV access case and someone who has a aneurysmal fistula, I'll tell a story of how one day I was I clamped the brachial artery, I clamped the fistula thinking that this was an aneurysmal AV fistula, when in fact, what they had been doing was they were sticking the brachial artery for dialysis accidentally. And what I was dealing with was not an AV fistula, but an aneurysmal brachial artery. And I learned that because when I clamped, I checked the pulse in the arm distally and found that the pulse was gone. And I also tell a story about a fellow that I used to work with, that I worked with many years ago, who was very, very anxious and pushy. And we were encountering a structure in an axillary aneurysm that he said, cut it, cut it, cut it, cut it. And I was like, and I answered, well, I'm not sure this is, I'm not sure what this is. And he kept pushing to cut it. We ended up cutting it, and it was the median nerve. And the fortunate thing is that this patient turned out had hand gangrene, so the cutting of the nerve didn't affect their function since they had no hand function. But the point of the story was I then used that to encourage the trainee to say, if you see something that I'm doing and you're worried about it, speak up so that we all are on the same page and we don't feel that there's going to be any problems. So successful teachers provide effective feedback and use praise authentically. And this is, as many of you know, the SWSC scale. And I encourage, if you haven't done it, that you, after every case, you give the resident the feedback to tell them how they're doing and that whether they are able to complete the case using active help, passive help, or whether they're really ready to do this case on their own independently. And I think this SWSC scale is really important because it gives the residents a sense of whether of their intraoperative performance And it also looks at the case complexity and gives the resident an idea of whether they're ready to move on in that specific type of operation. And as mentioned here, I think another way to look at it is the faculty should really decide what was their role. Did they have to talk them through it? Did they have to prompt them? I needed to be in the room just in case, or in reality, I didn't really need to be in the room at all. Successful teachers also know when to listen to their trainees. And one of the stories that I like to tell to my trainees is when I faced a very difficult case where the patient had an intraoperative arrest. We performed CPR. I finally decided that there was really no hope for the patient, and I scrubbed out, but the resident was still doing CPR. And I thought, well, I'll let them, they need to sort of figure out when it's time to stop. So I'll let them continue CPR. And to my surprise, a few minutes later, the patient got a return of vital signs, and the patient ended up leaving the hospital neurologically intact. So I said, so this is my clue to trainees, that I want to hear your ideas. I want to hear your thoughts. Successful faculty really invite their trainees to speak up. And I bring this slide up because Dr. Peter Glavitsky was one of my mentors at Mayo Clinic and was probably the best surgeon I've ever known, would actually ask me in the operating room, Chris, what do you think we should do? And he said it in a very humble way. He said it in a way that he really wanted my opinion. And I was awestruck that the idea that this icon of surgery was asking my opinion. But by doing that, he invited me to render my opinion, and I felt valued and part of the team. Successful teachers also know when it's important to lower stress when things are getting tough. And Dr. Stabile, who was our chair at Harbor UCLA, had this way, like when things got really hard in the operating room, he would stop for a moment and then make a self-deprecating joke and say, you know, we're slow, but we do poor work. And then he would start laughing, and then we would laugh, and then we would resume the operation. And so it's important to realize that excessive stress and tension in the OR will only harm learning. There's no need to yell or be stern when correcting techniques. I remember still I have PTSD from the cardiac surgeon screaming at me, use both hands, because I never remembered to have an instrument in my other hand. And you can give the same lesson without having to do that. So for example, you know, residents tend to raise their elbow up, and you can just say, look, your elbow is raised and this will put great stress on your shoulders long-term. Or you'll have much better fine motor control with your elbows in. Sometimes a little bit of gentle humor can also help. And so sometimes I'll tell the resident, imagine you're in a large family at a small table where there's very little elbow room, and you're holding books under your arms. And if you raise your arms, the books will fall. And this is sort of a clue to keep their elbows in. Or rather than yell at them to say, use both hands, I might say, well, you know, your other hand is a little worn out, I know that, but let me know when it's ready to get back into the operating room. So successful teachers also expect their trainees to succeed. And Dr. Julie Freischlag, who was actually a faculty member when I was a resident at Harbor UCLA, watched me one day perform an AV fistula and said to me, Chris, you're actually pretty good at this. I want you next time to take the resident through this, and I will watch you. And so she gave me this confidence to say, hey, I can actually perform this operation, which I didn't really myself believe. Successful teachers also welcome change and feedback. And so as a young faculty member, one of my chiefs told me, Chris, you're too slow in the OR. And I was really insulted. But when I thought about it, I actually realized that, you know, I was trying so hard to let the residents do important parts of the case that I didn't really set up the operation well. And I decided from then on that I was going to try to set it up in such a way that it was going to be efficient, and I was going to do parts of the case and make it look like the resident was doing the whole case when they really weren't. Successful teachers also recognize that a trainee learns at different pace. And in this study, we looked at the variation in learning curves of residents and realized that every resident doesn't learn in a linear fashion. Some learn at a slower pace than others, but that they all will eventually get to that goal. Successful teachers should also view themselves as a coach. And in this study, the authors looked at a comprehensive surgical coaching plan that demonstrated enhanced surgical skills when coaching was performed. And as outlined here, this coaching strategy included numerous things, including very detailed feedback, review of videotapes, and very targeted feedback for the trainees that improve their overall performance. Successful teachers bring fun into the operating room, and in the process may recruit new students into their field. And so this study looked at how surgical students are attracted to surgical careers. And they found that some very simple things like getting to suture in the operating room or driving the camera in the operating room dramatically, with an odds ratio of 4.8 and 7.2, dramatically increased their desire to go into to become a surgeon themselves. And so what I try to say is that, when I work with a trainee in the operating room, I focus on the surgeon trainee on correcting their errors, anticipating the next step, asking for the correct instruments, warning them about looming anatomy that might be there. But for the other people who aren't actually the main surgeon, I might then ask them questions about anatomy, let them have an opportunity to touch and feel the tissue, get them sewing and holding a camera. Another thing that I like to do is to use the Penrose drain because it's a great model for a vascular anastomosis. And so what I might do is on the back room of the table, set up a vascular anastomosis where the intern and the student are doing a vascular anastomosis. And then when I'm doing my stretching, I'll go back and look at their progress and give them feedback on how they're doing. It's also important to realize that your teaching style, your parenting style, looked here is important. And the best, in my view, style is someone who is authoritative, meaning not authoritarian, but authoritative, not permissive, someone who really cares about you, that sets clear standards, is assertive, but at the same time is responsive and has high expectations. And one of the final things that I like to say is that when you think about what top things that students say, it's important to think about this comment: top students around the world as they reflect what they love most about their mothers. And when they talk about their mothers, they say, and this I think is applicable to the surgeon educator, they spend quality time just with me, not with my brothers and sisters around. So the OR is a great opportunity for one-on-one time with the learner. They let me play outside a lot. So I encourage you all to give graded autonomy to your trainees. They told me stories. Again, experiential cases and what you learned about them can be very helpful to your trainees. They gave me hugs and kisses and sat and spoke with me privately. Now, of course, you won't do that, but you will. But you will give genuine praise to the trainee because that really goes a long way. You disciplined me and made me feel like she cared. So again, we're not talking about just giving praise. It's also about constructively providing feedback to the residents who so much crave that feedback. Left special message in my desk or my lunch bag. So I try to, at the end of a case, an hour or two later, send an email or a text, particularly when they've done a good job, to let them know what a great job they've done that day. So in summary, I think that the operating room really presents itself with a unique opportunity to teach. It's important to realize that residents today are just as capable as we are, arguably even better or even more capable than we were. And yet they haven't had necessarily the same opportunities for autonomy. So come to the OR with a plan in mind. I think it's important to realize that you want to be able to relate to that resident and provide important autonomous opportunities. And it's important to eliminate OR distractions. Try to take mini breaks on occasion. Use that opportunity to tell stories. Create an environment that encourages residents to speak up. Try to engage the whole team, including the interns and the students. Those little things, such as the opportunity to feel tissue or to practice a stitch in the back, can be important. Be approachable. Use an authoritative style of teaching. Give both positive and negative feedback. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present today.
I wish I would have had that lecture about 40 years ago.
This is the last, but certainly not least, although that was, you know, a superlative set. Dr. Albrecht, I agree with you. We could have used that session a long time ago. Things, you know, there's a lecture, things I wish I'd known, right? To wrap up, wow, what a great time we've all had together. This is the last but not least session. You know, this is a meeting that we wanted this to be an overview of all kinds of things.